That project to get the Afrikaners out of poverty was successful. It had different dimensions. One of them was to get Afrikaner people educated,
yes,
and to get people to get their children to university and to go and study and become professionally qualified and get a job and work, etc. The one thing that I must accept is the true fact that in the National Party days, a lot of Afrikaners who were not professionally qualified did get work on semi-state institutions. So many worked on the railway,
railways,
or in the police, or in the civil service. But that was a certain section of the Afrikaner people. Now today, you don't find many Afrikaners there. Well, there's nothing to work on the rail. It doesn't exist to a very large extent, unfortunately.
Yeah. And it was the largest employer at
It
that
was.
time.
And I can understand that the ANC now assists black people and young, poor people to go into those professions.
And state-owned enterprises.
That's fine. But then you must make sure that those enterprises are successful and not closing them down one after the other because they are failing. We should have people at the top who are entrepreneurs and business people,
yes,
and not deployed politicians, failed politicians from this place to that place to the next.
Before they controlled the economy, before they ran the banks, before they built some of the most powerful companies in South Africa, Afrikaners were poor, not just struggling, broken. By the early 1900s, thousands of Afrikaner families were living in poverty, displaced, unskilled, competing for survival. This was called the poor white problem, and it terrified the people in power. Because if white South Africans fell into poverty, then the entire system of racial hierarchy would begin to crack. So something had to be done. Not charity, not reform, but something far more powerful. A system that would take one group of people and engineer them into economic dominance.
The Anglo-Boer War had created a class of poor whites who scraped subsistence from the soil. Destitute, virtually their one remaining possession was their white skin. During the early decades of this century, drought and soil erosion drove these poor white Afrikaners off their land into the cities they looked upon as the devil's own, seeking the very manual jobs they had despised as fit only for blacks. This mass migration became known as the Second Great Trek. But in the cities, Afrikaners were strangers in their own country.
The roots of Afrikaner poverty go back to one devastating moment. The Second Boer War. British forces destroyed farms, livelihoods, and entire communities.
In the Anglo-Boer War, about 30,000 farms were destroyed and the houses burned down. Thousands of live animals and livestock were killed and culled by the British. Many people went into concentration camps. More than 30,000 women and children died in the concentration camps. My own grandmother was in the concentration camps. She was a girl of 13 years old. Her father was fighting the war. Her mother was dead. She had to look after 4 younger brothers in the concentration camp.
When the war ended, Afrikaners didn't just lose politically. They lost economically. Thousands moved to cities, but they weren't prepared for industrial work. And worse, they were now competing with black South Africans who had more experience in wage labor. For many Afrikaners, this was humiliation, white but poor. And in a society built on racial hierarchy, that was unacceptable.
White workers, called civilized labor, had always been paid more than blacks and had all the best jobs. The myth of racial superiority paid off in hard cash. But in 1921, the price of gold fell. Mine owners said they had to cut costs by employing cheaper blacks in jobs reserved for whites only. The white miners had been broken. Within 2 years, white workers voted General Hertzog into power. Hertzog promised protection against both British capitalists and competition from blacks. The white miners, terrified by what they called the Black Peril, seized the British mines. Their slogan was, "Workers of the world unite to keep South Africa white." It became illegal for a black man to lay a brick.
Then, while all this was happening, in 1918, a quiet organization was formed, the Afrikaner Broederbond.
The Afrikaner Broederbond was formed in 1918 in Johannesburg, more than 100 years ago. And you will remember that this follows the Second Anglo-Boer War, which created unknown poverty within the Afrikaner community. That led to huge poverty when people came from the rural areas to cities. Urbanization followed, and the social ills that normally happens when there are uncontrolled urbanization also started with Afrikaners living in terrible conditions in the cities in Johannesburg, in Pretoria, and in other parts of the country. And there was no work for Afrikaners. You remember that the union started in 1910. It was mainly an English-dominating society, with Afrikaners being second-class citizens in their own country, losing the war, and did not have any benefit from the war. In fact, it became worse. And then in 1918, some students, teachers, members of the cloth came together in Johannesburg and said, but we need to do something about this. And they formed the Afrikaner Broederbond, a cultural organization with its main aim to uplift the Afrikaner from the squalid conditions that the Afrikaner found himself in. And the workings of the Afrikaner Bond contributed, and we normally put it out in three phases, that we contributed to firstly the educational upliftment of the Afrikaner, and that's why so many of our grandparents and their parents became involved in education, went to teachers training colleges and started to train young Afrikaners and to educate them. Then economic upliftment followed, which we created with savings from Afrikaners. We did not have any government assisted facility at that stage, so we had to do everything ourselves. So that happened with the economic upliftment of the Afrikaner. So we created saving funds from which people knowledgeable invested those funds, and started with industries which today we still recognize as huge industries in this country. And then after that, the political empowerment followed, with the involvement in the 1948 election where the National Party took power, and then also with the burning desire for a Republican ideal, to form a republic, to get rid of the Union of South Africa and to have an independent Republic of South Africa, which indeed followed in 1961. So that's the roots of the Afrikaner Broederbond, mainly to start with work in the poor upliftment, or the upliftment of the poor Afrikaners.
The National Party pervades Afrikaner society, from the grassroots level to the so-called Brotherhood, a secret society said to make all the important policy decisions in South Africa. The party is intimately linked to the Dutch Reformed Church, to the schools and universities, cultural organizations, certain trade unions, and Afrikaans newspapers. In addition, the nationalists have packed all branches of government with their supporters: the civil service, the police, military leadership, judgeships, prison warders, the secret police, are overwhelmingly Afrikaner. Out of a small white population of 4 million, there are over 1 million more Afrikaners than English speakers. With their ability to mobilize the Afrikaner vote and to a large degree mold public opinion, the nationalists increased their share of the popular vote throughout the 60s. They rendered all other parties impotent, and even outlawed some. Once in power, the National Party controlled the law-making process. Immediately, it began to manipulate the law, making it the major weapon of the lager. Every aspect of human activity, sport, sex, education, politics, was controlled. With every law enacted, the freedom of the individual was whittled away. The one standard the nationalists have set for themselves, by which everything is judged, is the security of the state. And since 1948, the state has meant the Afrikaner vote.
In 1948, the plan became reality. The National Party came into power. Apartheid wasn't just about separation. It was about economic engineering. Policies were introduced to protect and uplift white workers, especially Afrikaners. One of the most powerful tools, the Mines and Works Act. This law reserved skilled, high-paying jobs for white workers, not based on merit, but on race. At the same time, government contracts were awarded to Afrikaner businesses. Foreign competition was limited, state resources were redirected. The message was clear: the system would choose who wins. Now came the real transformation. Institutions were created, not just to make money, but to build a people. Financial power came first. The rise of Sanlam and Volkskas Bank. These weren't just banks, they were funding machines for Afrikaner businesses. Then came industry.
During the 20s and 30s, the government established powerful state monopolies like ISCOR, the Iron and Steel Corporation of South Africa, to break the British monopoly of economic power.
After all, Afrikaners have essentially, over this period of this century, since the Boer War, run a revolution against British dominance in South Africa. It's even a continuing revolution.
The government backed giants like ISCO and Sasol. These were massively state-supported corporations. They created jobs, but not just any jobs. Jobs for Afrikaners. By now, something powerful had formed. A closed system. Government gives contracts. Banks fund Afrikaner businesses. Companies hire Afrikaners. Schools train Afrikaner professionals. Then it repeats over and over again. This wasn't luck, it wasn't coincidence, it was design, a self-reinforcing machine.
Dr. Milan's cabinet, the first composed purely of Afrikaners, began to implement the final answer to the black peril, apartheid, the complete separation of blacks from the white lager. Discrimination had always existed in South Africa, whatever white group was in power, but the nationalists now institutionalized it, depriving non-whites of any expectation of ever achieving equality with whites.
Of course, given the situation as we find it here in South Africa, we had to exploit alternative means to solve the problems or to restructure society without endangering the future of the whites. I mean, basically one may dither about it, but it is a matter of white survival. And in that phrase, I include very strongly Afrikaner survival.
In just a few decades, Afrikaners went from struggling farmers to controlling banks, industry, energy, the state itself, not by accident, not by chance, but by design.
They try to kill your language.
Yes.
They try to kill your culture. And obviously, in 1948, you get the overwhelming majority through the National Party, and you start implementing laws to correct that.
Yes.
Laws that also exclusively benefited the Afrikaner minority.
Yes.
Now, I just want to ask, why would you be against a government if they say we are implementing laws to correct what was happening in apartheid?
Sure.
Today, South Africa has a different system, one designed to correct the past. It's called Black Economic Empowerment. And at its core, it asks the same question: can the state reshape the economy to uplift a group that was left behind? But history leaves us with something deeper. Not whether it can work, but how it works, who it benefits, and what it costs.
You know, black economic empowerment was never ANC policy. The ANC during the struggle against apartheid was a multiracial organization.
Yeah.
So it couldn't come up with a policy that favored one race or another, because it was a multiracial organization. Black economic empowerment was handed over as a policy largely from Sanlam, which was from the National Party.
Yes.
Because they saw that as a way of creating this alliance that you are talking about.
Yes.
They bought off the leadership of the ANC with giving them shares in what actually were marginal companies in the scheme of things of Afrikaner capital.
Yes.
I mean, Metropolitan Life, which is what Sanlam used to create New Africa Investment Limited, the heart of black economic empowerment. was a marginal company in the scheme of Sanlam.
Yes, yes.
It was a life. First, it was listed on its own, and secondly, 85% of its life policyholders were African and colored. So it was a marginal company.
Yes, yes.
And they used that marginal company to bring in leaders of the ANC, of the PAC, literally to buy them off.
Yeah.
And then that became the modus operandi of big business, was that we, big business, we want to buy off these new rulers so that they suppress competition, and so on and so forth, and leave us to operate the way we have been operating all along.
Yeah.
So black economic empire, many people think it was created by the ANC. Then the ANC, I was in the research department of the ANC in exile. We never had any policy of black economic empowerment. This was handed over to the ANC by Sanlam.
The rise of Afrikaner wealth wasn't a mystery. It was a blueprint, a system that proved something powerful. If you control the state, you can control the economy. And if you control the economy, you can shape the future. The question is, who controls it now?
One should remember that the Afrikaners regarded themselves just like the New Englanders as a chosen people, This is rooted in the Old Testament, in Protestant religion, Calvinism especially. And in the interior of South Africa, they only had the Bible as literature because of their isolation from the West, from the mother country, they were actually cut off from Holland. So they got their ideas directly from the Bible. Some ideas in regard even to the non-whites, which they regard as Canaanites, and themselves as a chosen people with a mission.